Hello, Yvonne. Welcome to CRO Wisdom, the voice for risk leaders.
Good morning, Atul. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Yvonne. Yvonne, let's start by telling the viewers a little bit about yourself, about your background.
Sure, Atul. Thank you very much. Yeah, I've been in risk management for pretty much all my career. First line of defense, second line of defense, third line of defense. Had a little bit of a stint in the business as well, managing a rather large business abroad for one of the companies I worked for. Currently at Guardian Life of America, managing the operational risk function, which includes, amongst other things, third-party risk, information security oversight, and business continuity oversight as well.
One of the things people are always interested in, Yvonne, is how do people start their career in risk management? How did you start your career in risk management?
Yeah, interesting. I was out of business school, and it was a management, joined Citigroup as a management associate, a training program. 6 months into the training program with Citigroup down in Latin America, in Colombia specifically, they asked me, given my analytical skill set at that point, if I would be interested in joining risk management. And so it was a little bit of by luck, but I think it's one of those leadership traits that they identified a gap in the business, that they needed somebody who had that analytical background and could help them develop scorecards. We were doing credit scoring back in the early 1990s at Citi, and that was one of the first things that I learned how to do, algorithms for scoring, which in today's world is artificial intelligence on steroids, right? So
right.
A little bit of an interesting background there.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. So, Yvonne, when you think about the current risk environment and think about 2021, what are your key priorities?
The key thing that we have to do in risk management has been, always will be, but even more in today's world, is looking around the corners, right? Anticipating what can go wrong, but at the same time balancing our priorities. You can't put everything at the same level. You have to learn to prioritize the big risks, what can bring down a company. Really focusing on leveraging the different tool sets and different engagements that you have with external parties, networking, your technology, artificial intelligence inclusive, and just making sure that you're leveraging those tools to look around the corner and make sure that you're identifying key risk. And those could be multiple risk factors, right? There could be third-party risk, as we know. It could be information security risk. It could be business continuity risk, climate risk, AI risk. So, all of the different risk elements, being able to look around that corner. In today's world, it's actually even more important, right? Because you have to do it much faster. In the past, we had technology wasn't moving as fast, and as a result, we had a little bit more of a luxury of dealing with time. Today's world, you don't have that luxury. You have to react very quickly.
Yeah, Yvonne, really interesting. You talked about all the different kinds of risk, and we're definitely seeing that traditionally a lot of companies focus too heavily on just finance or financial risk and cyber risk. And you just talked about a number of other risks. Can you expand on that as you particularly start thinking about the future, other than kind of like AI risk and others, technology risk, what are the risks you want to make sure that one ought to be monitoring?
That's a very good question, Atul. I think that what I worry about, it's something that, as a risk manager, the first thing I should say is that you don't know everything. And if you recognize that, then you learn to be a better risk manager. And so with that, what I try to do is constantly challenge myself. It's not only looking around the corner, it's, what do you need to look for? And one of the things that I've learned is that, it's an interesting organizational structure in any type of industry, in any company that you work at, that everything is kind of, functionally driven or job driven, hierarchy driven, right? And what I sense a lot of times is that if you can connect the dots between functions, between people, between risks, you get a much more holistic picture of how to manage risk. And I grew up as a credit officer at Citigroup and made my way up the chain of command to be a senior credit officer there at some point. And what I learned is that it's not only about managing credit risk, it's about managing the connectivity of all of these different risks that I just mentioned. If you do that, you become a much better risk manager. And that's how I eventually evolved into operational risk, because leveraging that skill set that I adapted to being a senior credit officer, I was able to move into more broader risk management very easily. But you have to constantly challenge yourself on that front. And so just learning about compliance risk and the connectivity with operational risk and so forth makes you just a better risk manager to be able to, as I said, look around the corner.
Ivan, you made a really interesting point about the dots, connecting the dots. Interestingly, a few years ago, I had the opportunity to meet with Tom Friedman, the famous author and columnist from New York Times. And he had just written a book on environmental issues, green. And I said to him, I said, you've always talked about globalization, and how have you kind of connected with outsourcing and green and others? And literally what he said to me was, it's a tool. One thing I realized very early on is this whole ability to connect the dots. And so this ability to see patterns that others might not see. Now, of course, in today's world, we have this tremendous opportunity to leverage automation and AI tools to be able to connect those dots for sure.
Definitely.
So, Ivan, when you talked about all those different kinds of risks and having a wide risk aperture that's important for future of risk management, often we see in companies that many of these solutions are individual. So you might have one of these being monitored by compliance, something else by sourcing, some is in operational risk, somebody might be in some other area of the company. So how do you think about managing this whole challenge and addressing this whole challenge of being able to provide an integrated view of risk to both your group, but also to the company?
It kind of goes back a tool to, I don't know everything. But one thing I do know is that if I can bring people together in a formal governance structure and we have conversations around how we connect, what are the risks, the intertwining of the different elements of success and failure, and those could be internal as well as external, right? Lessons learned, root cause. That's, I think, how you start to develop a better risk practice. Again, it's not always about paper-based exercises. Risk and control self-assessments. I'm a big fan of governance. Have always been, will always be. And you and I, early days into the pandemic, we discussed some of the risks of working remote, such as the video conference that we're doing right now. I miss that human element. I miss sitting down with colleagues around the table, informally, formally, and having a discussion about what do you think about what's happening in this particular industry. And it doesn't always have to be, in my case, insurance. We span different, our customer base has multiple different angles to it, right? And likewise, our service providers and folks that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. So having those conversations on a periodic basis, sitting down at a table under a formal governance structure, for me, is the key to connecting the dots and making sure that you have solid dialogue around risk.
That's a great point. A formal governance structure is one of the key elements. Ivan, when you think about all the challenges, particularly in 2020 with limitations on travel, so not being able to do risk assessments, and also very clearly the need for continuous monitoring became very obvious. So a two-part question is, how are you addressing the inability to do those physical assessment? And number two is, how are you incorporating continuous monitoring in your future of risk management?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge, not being able to do these face-to-face assessments and going on site, where we have operations, visiting India, where we have, in the case of Guardian, we have back office operations in India, or going to our different sites and meeting with people, understanding their concerns. It's definitely a challenge. technology has helped significantly, and it doesn't replace the human element, but I think you have to leverage it as much as possible. And so doing those, those phone calls, the Zoom meetings, having intelligent conversations, not just checking in and saying, well, how are things going, but kind of, prepping. Let's have a discussion on a particular risk or a particular concern or a particular emerging topic. I think, you have to already narrow in. People's attention on Zoom tends to wander off, right? And so I think there's an art as well to how you do these Zoom calls, how you have conversations. Then the other thing is, as you mentioned, Atul, leveraging technology, right? Technology, we're already leveraging an external toolkit, and that includes, reaching out to different stakeholders and suppliers who give us information on third parties, right? Or information security, threat management, monitoring. Financial scores, DNB, for example, is one that we use, amongst others, right? Without getting into specifics. But I think you have to, we have to learn to leverage as much information that's out there. There's a lot. Sometimes it's too much. And in some cases, you get different information. In some cases, you may overreact to information. So, like anything else, you have to sift through what's relevant and what's not and make intelligent decisions.
Right. Yeah, no, there's definitely a tremendous amount of technologies out there today, both from a workflow perspective and risk intelligence, continuous monitoring perspective, that one needs to think through and say, how do I change my workflows and my governance to incorporate that? Now for the fun question, Bloomberg recently declared risk manager to be a hot job. What do you think about that, Ivan?
Well, look, I think it always has been. It always will be. And we human nature is we always go through crises, right? 10 years ago, we were also in the spotlight, if you recall, during the financial crisis. And before that, it was the dot-com crisis. And before that, it was the emerging debt crisis. So kind of like every 10 years, there's some sort of crisis, and the spotlight shines on risk management. I think if everyone were to, as risk managers, we were to understand the importance of our role in understanding what's around the corner, understanding how we develop partnerships and connect the dots. You won't only be in the spotlight when there's a crisis. The objective is to avoid having to go through a crisis and manage it appropriately, And so I kind of view my job as always being in the spotlight. And it's our job to create that value added as risk managers for our businesses, leadership, the value add that they see that we're always on the spotlight, that we always have a seat at the table, that we always have an opinion. And that way you're always in the spotlight, and not only in the spotlight when there's a crisis. That's how I would view it. Now, it's always good to be in the spotlight when there's a crisis, but I prefer not to be in the, I try to avoid the crisis.
Yeah. No, you said a few things that I just wanted to reinforce, have the insights, have an opinion, engage the stakeholders. And so I think it's well deserved that risk managers have been identified by Bloomberg as a hot job, because if you look at the last so many months, I think risk leaders have done an amazing job at ensuring resiliency across the world in so many corporations, so many agencies.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So Ivan, talk to us about you as a professional. What resources do you rely on to make yourself a better professional?
So yeah, I'm always networking, and I network primarily because, as I said before, I don't know everything, and hopefully, as a risk manager, as any professional, I always challenge anyone that I interact with that you're always learning, no matter how much you know, no matter how old you are, and so wisdom evolves, and I think it's always about networking intelligently, meeting people who can complement what you know, who can give you insights into where certain things may be heading. It could be technology, it could be supply chains, it could be as we've discussed, pandemics, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that for me is one of the key things that I always attempt to do. A lot of people view networking on a different scale, right? A lot of times it's looking for your next job. That's not what I view networking as in risk management. Networking is sitting down with people like yourself, Atul, and your colleagues at Supply Wisdom, and having a neo group and discussing how they're engaging with other stakeholders. Yeah, the external view is extremely important, benchmarking externally, because internally it's kind of easy, right? I can sit down with the CISO, I can sit down with our compliance head, I can sit down with my business colleagues, and we can have great conversations, but inward looking is always easier. The external part is where you get the insights of not only what others are doing, but what's around that corner.
Wonderful. So my final question, Ivan, what advice would you give to future leaders who are thinking about or considering making a future in risk management?
Yeah, it's a good question, Atul. I'm not too sure if there's a playbook. Maybe when I retire, I'll write a playbook on a book on that success story. I think resiliency is one of the key things. Being able to be flexible, knowing when to say no, knowing when to say yes, knowing how to prioritize, knowing how to leverage technology, knowing how to leverage governance, developing partnerships. There's no one single thing. I just shot out 5. And so how you balance those elements, skills in particular situations, in particular cultures, right? Each organization that I've worked has had a different culture, and they've been in different states of their maturity. One can expand on that and say, if you work in a different geography, you have to have a completely different skill set. And so I think it's that adaptability / resiliency, and ability to create partnerships, ability to use technology and make those right decisions, say yes, say no, balanced, and always managing to prioritize. That would be, it's probably a recipe, but like any recipe, sometimes you put in a little bit more of one ingredient, and sometimes you put in a little bit more of another ingredient, and it depends on the mood of the day. The recipe may come out better. I'm not a chef, by the way, but I kind of
sounded like one.
I did a good job, right? Probably had the family cracking up in the background.
Ivan, thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of CRO Wisdom, the voice for risk leaders. And to the audience, if there's a guest you have in mind that you want us to interview, that you would like to hear from, please send a nomination to info@riskboard.org. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Atul, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Ivan.